So this week, we continue through Matthew's parables. Last week, we heard the fairly well-known parable of the sower. This week is the comparatively less well-known parable of the weeds, or parable of the tares, depending on who you listen to, because tares is how the committee translating the King James Version interpreted the Greek word used in the original text. The end result is the same, regardless of your preferred title. Now, last week, I told you about my husband Kevin's determination at removing the weeds, the dandelions, from our lawn, and the results of that quest. This week, the more appropriate analogy is my own attempt to get the front garden into what I deem presentable shape. Full disclosure, I am not a gardener. I don't like getting schmutz under my nails, and I don't like wearing gloves. And as a result, I don't spend a whole lot of time with my hands in the dirt. So I don't know what I was thinking when I said I'd make our flower bed presentable. When we moved in, it was not a happy-looking garden. Sure, it was green-ish. But there were a few bush-like things struggling at the back of it near the house. But for the most part, it was grasses, yet more dandelions, and a smattering of other miscellaneous ground cover type things, greenish. And one particularly pretty stem that stood straight up with purplish and greenish leaves. And so I set out on a sunny day not unlike today, to remove what was clearly out of place, and to work around what we wanted to keep. I had my hand tools, a small fork, a spade, and went to work. In Jesus' parable this morning, he tells of the sower, who again has gone out to plant, and of the weeds that grow up amongst the intended crop. He tells us that the farmer had the right tools, the right intentions, and the right practices. The farmer here is completely faultless, though they do use some unorthodox farming techniques. The farming practice at the time when this story was first told would have been to remove the weeds early on and separate them out from the growing wheat crop. But for this metaphor, Jesus argues otherwise. Leave them alone, he says, because if you disturb them, you will disturb the good crop. With the discovery of the weeds, Jesus warns against drastic actions, lest the crop be damaged. For us, it is often tempting to take swift and decisive action when we see something we feel is out of place or wrong. It is tempting to see the different and want to make it like us, or at the very least make it into something non-intrusive, or at the very least not challenging. We don't want to hurt ourselves or our communities after all, and so the most obvious choice when confronted with something new or different is to remove it, change it, make the difference just go away. Now, I tried. I really did to keep what looked like it could have been peonies. When I went to pull up the roots of the spindly little weed next to it, I really was careful. But after a few attempts, it became quite clear that more force was necessary. So, down came the hoe, with perhaps a bit too much force. Went right through the offending weed's roots, all right. Also went right through some of the roots of the plant right next to it. So, out that weed came, along with what could have been peonies. And even after working at this, carefully avoiding the good plants and steadfastly going after the weeds for, it had to have been at least an hour, I'd only made it this far across the garden, which is like this long. Clearly, drastic measures were going to be necessary if any progress was going to be made. So, what with a more fire sale mentality, everything must go. Soon, great pieces of what can only be accurately described as sod were coming up. Grasses, dandelions, bulbs, little purple-green leaf shoots, all tangled together in a clump of roots and dirt and worms and leaves. It was a mess, and heavy work, but got all the weeds out, and I could finally plant my fresh seeds. Going back to Jesus' parable, it is clear from his retelling of it to the disciples that he is arguing for a very time this story was first told would have been to remove the reeds on site. Yet, Jesus argues otherwise for the sake of the story. Leave them alone, he says, because if you disturb them, two things will happen. First, you will disturb the good crop, as I most definitely did in my garden. And two, you will be making judgments that only God can and will accurately make. The second point isn't quite as obvious in the text as the concern with harming the intended crop. And so I'm going to do something that I don't normally do. I'm going to appeal to authority. And not just any authority, but a pair of old bedouin guys. Neither of whom you will hear me cite again for, well, possibly ever. This is not my preferred method. First up is Martin Luther, a Catholic monk by trade who got fed up with the church, nailed some theses to a door, and founded, for lack of a better phrase, the Lutheran Church in the early 1500s. Now, according to one of Luther's sermons on this parable, he argued that only God can separate the false from the true believers, the wheat from the weeds. And so any actions that we take to suss out where others are should be categorized as futile, prideful, and understood as actions that harm not just us, but those we judge as well. Second, I want to refer to Augustine, more properly referred to as Saint Augustine or Augustine of Hippo. He's much, much farther back than Luther. He lived during the late 300s, and much of his writing is somewhat more opaque than Luther's. He's the primary old scholar where we get the idea that biblical text should be interpreted not as strictly literal, but rather as metaphorical, if it contradicts what we know from science and our own reasoning. He was also phenomenally prolific, and some of his work is still taught in seminaries, like the one that I attended not so long ago. His take on this parable was to say this in a letter to someone. I tell you of a truth, my beloved. Even in these high seats there is both wheat and tares, and among the laity there is wheat and tares. Let the good tolerate the bad. Let the bad change themselves and imitate the good. Let us all, if it may be so, attain to God. Let us seek after good days. Again, the moral here is the same. There is none like God, as Isaiah says. And we cannot know the heart of a person in the same way that God does. For, as the psalmist also says, God knows us, all of us, our hearts and souls and minds and bodies, often far better than we know ourselves, let alone others. We should not, and indeed cannot, make sweeping condemnations because we deem the different to be bad. Meanwhile, back in my garden, the new seeds I have planted have taken root. There are plenty of new green shoots and leaves sprouting up out of the earth. And in amongst them are a few purplish-green sprigs, just an inch or so tall. Apparently, what I was unsure about, but ultimately being a weed and therefore undesirable and tossed out with the grasses and dandelions, is determined to stay. And to be honest, it adds some much-needed variation to an otherwise bland canvas. Thanks be to God.